Here we go. I'm Joe. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, no matter what time zone you are in right now. Welcome back to Sip and Talk. I'm so excited for this one. Next to me, as always, is my favorite co-host, Sunny.
Hey, everyone. It is great to be here.
Hi, everyone. How are you doing today?
I am doing great. Really ready to get into some pretty heavy but just incredibly fascinating global mechanics today.
Absolutely. So, Sip and Talkers, honestly, have you noticed that lately the absolute hottest extracurricular class in Moscow seems to be Mandarin Chinese?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it is practically mandatory at this point.
Right. Because we are 4 years into this grinding conflict that has just completely exhausted Russia.
Yeah.
And the narrative out there in Washington right now is so loud.
It is everywhere.
Yeah. Everyone is saying Russia has suffered a strategic defeat, and they are just basically surviving on life support from Beijing. Like, imagine borrowing money to keep your house, but the bank demands to move 300,000 of its own people into your backyard, and then they rename your town.
It sounds like a bad movie plot.
Exactly. But that isn't a hypothetical. That is exactly what Beijing is quietly doing to Russia right now.
It is wild when you actually look at the mechanics of it. So today we are going to objectively unpack the shifting tectonic plates of global geopolitics and asymmetric warfare. And we are specifically looking at all of this through our American lens.
Right, because under Trump, our national security and our tech sectors have just become completely obsessed with a few of these major global flashpoints. The landscape is changing so fast, and the old rules of engagement they just do not seem to apply anymore.
No, they really don't.
So today on Sip and Talk, we are breaking down the truth behind this so-called Russia-China vassal myth. We are looking at Ukraine's totally sci-fi drone war in the Black Sea, and we are going to connect what all of this means for our own policies, our tech supply chains, and our strategies in the Taiwan Strait.
It is a lot of ground to cover.
It is.
Mm-hmm.
And we are going to impartially report on all of this. We are not taking sides, just giving you the objective truth of what the data and the actual geopolitical maneuvers are showing us. Oh, and just a quick disclaimer before we get into the heavy stuff.
Right, the legal part.
Yeah, we're not investment experts. So any economic data, trade figures, or commodity pricing we discuss today is strictly to give you geopolitical context.
Yeah.
Okay. It is not investment advice.
Exactly. We are here to look at the mechanics of global power. And honestly, the mechanics right now are fascinating. It all connects through this one central theme of asymmetric power.
Which is such a tech scene concept, right?
Totally. It is the idea that you don't necessarily need the biggest military or the largest economy to exert massive influence if you know, like, exactly where to apply the pressure.
Let's start with that Russian narrative then. The word you hear thrown around constantly by our politicians is that Moscow is entirely on life support from Beijing.
Right, the vassal state narrative.
Yeah, that they have been reduced to a mere vassal state and that China is the new boss just calling all the shots. Is that actually true?
It is a really compelling narrative, and you can see why it caught on, but it's a dangerous oversimplification. I was reading some brilliant analysis recently from the Carnegie Endowment and the Financial Times, and they really break down the reality of what we call asymmetric dependence.
Okay, so what do the numbers actually say?
Well, there is no denying the economic shift. Over 40% of Russia's imports are now coming from China.
Wow, 40%.
Yeah, and furthermore, the Chinese RMB now accounts for over 50% of Russian foreign exchange transactions. So the financial reliance is honestly staggering.
That is a massive pivot for a country that used to really pride itself on being this standalone global superpower.
It is, and you can see exactly how China wields this leverage now. Let's look at the mechanics of the negotiations for the Power of Siberia 2 natural gas pipeline.
Oh, I read about this. They're playing extreme hardball, right?
Beyond hardball, China has taken this brutal, almost predatory negotiating stance. They're essentially demanding that Russia supply gas at the heavily subsidized prices that Chinese domestic consumers pay.
Wait, so basically nothing?
Exactly. It is pennies on the dollar. And they aren't even committing to buying the massive volumes that Russia desperately wants to sell to replace their lost European market.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, a decade ago when Russia was negotiating from a position of strength, that would have been unthinkable. Today, Beijing absolutely holds the pricing power.
You know, it sounds like Russia mortgaged its soul, but the debt collector, in this case China, suddenly realizes the client has a terrible temper and is holding a live grenade in their hand.
Haha. I wouldn't just call it a simple debt collector situation, though. That's a fun analogy. It is more of a highly calculated strategic symbiosis.
Meaning they need each other, but in different ways.
Exactly. Beijing knows exactly where the red line is. If they push too hard, if they squeeze the Russian economy so tightly that the Russian state actually collapses, China suddenly faces a massive, unstable security threat along thousands of miles of its northern border.
Oh, right. They do not want a pro-Western government or just absolute chaos right next door.
Right. They can't let them fail, but they don't want them too strong either. They want them perfectly dependent.
Perfectly dependent. That is a great way to put it. It is a strategic symbiosis, not a master and servant dynamic.
Precisely. China gets access to deeply discounted energy, and they get a strategic shield against us, the U.S. and our Western allies. Meanwhile, Russia gets the vital economic and technological input it needs to simply survive our sanctions. Both sides are getting exactly what they need for this specific moment in history.
And you can see the shifting dynamic playing out in real time in places outside of Russia, too.
Right.
Like, take Central Asia. Places like Kazakhstan have traditionally been firmly in Russia's backyard, but now they are totally pivoting east.
That is a crucial piece of the puzzle. Since we initiated our extreme sanctions on Russia, Central Asian countries are basically in survival mode. Look at Kazakhstan's president. He literally sat next to Putin and refused to recognize the independence of the Russian-occupied territories in Ukraine.
Just right to his face. That takes some serious nerve.
It really does. But they can afford that nerve because Beijing is stepping in. They are using the Belt and Road Initiative and the China Central Asia Summit to basically rewrite the map.
They're just flooding the zone with infrastructure money, right?
Exactly. For Central Asia, Beijing offers a massive lifeline. They have deep pockets, a massive market, and crucially, they don't carry the historical baggage of imperial expansion that Moscow does.
Right, they aren't going to roll tanks in.
Exactly. They aren't threatening to annex parts of Kazakhstan the way some Russian nationalists do on television. The economic pivot of Central Asia toward the east is practically irreversible at this point.
Okay, but this idea of imperial expansion and territory brings up something really interesting. If China holds so much leverage over a bleeding Russia, why don't they just forcefully take back Outer Manchuria?
You mean the historical lands?
Yeah, we are talking about places like Vladivostok that the Soviets took from them back in the 19th century. Is their current global strategy driven by some deep historical desire for revenge? Because there is this theory that is incredibly popular among our U.S. politicians right now.
Oh, I know where you're going with this.
Yeah, the idea is that China is pumping these fentanyl precursors. Man, my tongue is tied today.
The precursors, yes.
Yeah.
It happens.
Anyway, the theory is that they are pumping these fentanyl precursors into our borders as a deliberate reverse opium war. Like it's a targeted emotional revenge plot for the 19th century.
Right, the reverse opium war thesis. It makes for a great political soundbite for our representatives in Washington.
It definitely gets clicks.
Oh, absolutely. But if you look at the actual mechanics of the chemical industry and global trade, it is not an emotional, state-sponsored revenge plot. It is a highly calculated, asymmetric bargaining chip.
A bargaining chip. How does that actually work in practice?
Well, China is a massive producer of these precursor chemicals. Their domestic drug laws are incredibly strict, but their chemical manufacturing sector is huge, highly fragmented, and primarily made up of private companies.
Okay, so lots of small players.
Right. Now, their export controls on these private chemical companies are notoriously lax, but Beijing uses that laxity as a diplomatic valve. When our negotiations with them are deteriorating, say, over tax sanctions or our CHIPS Act, they just loosen the valve.
So they just look the other way.
Exactly. They look the other way as these chemicals flow out to cartels. But when negotiations are going well or they want a specific concession from us, they suddenly tighten regulations. They will raid a few factories and crack down hard.
Wow, that is incredibly cynical.
It is. But it is a lever of influence, right? It's a way to apply asymmetric pressure on our society. Not some century-old emotional vendetta.
That makes terrifying strategic sense. But what about the Russian territory then? I mean, 1 million square kilometers of land that used to be theirs.
Well, a Soviet-style military annexation is completely off the table. It is impossible because it risks a nuclear war. You just do not launch a conventional invasion against a state with the world's largest nuclear arsenal, no matter how economically weak they are.
Wait, hold on, though. Russia is a deeply paranoid, hyper-nationalistic state. Putin has built his entire brand on projecting strength. You're telling me he is just looking the other way while China slowly takes over?
Yes.
How does that not trigger massive internal pushback in Moscow?
Because Moscow doesn't have a choice right now. And that is the genius of China's 21st century method of creeping demographic expansion. They don't need to fire A single shot to take the territory back.
Because it's all economics.
Exactly. The Russian Far East is economically isolated from the wealthy western part of Russia. The local governors out there are desperate for cash and infrastructure, so China is pouring investments into the region.
I read that over 300,000 Chinese citizens have already settled there.
Right, setting up businesses and completely integrating into the local economy. Beijing even went so far as to mandate the use of traditional Chinese names for Russian cities like Vladivostok on all their official maps.
Wow. They are practically buying the region wholesale. Why fight a war when you can just lease the land, build the roads, move your people in, and just wait?
Precisely. If you are Beijing, why spend blood and treasure to conquer a dying wolf when you can just put a collar on it by feeding it? They are gaining all the economic and strategic benefits of the territory, like access to the Sea of Japan, without triggering a nuclear crisis or destroying their alliance with Moscow.
So China is taking territory via economics, because military force is just way too risky. But what happens when a smaller country applies that same kind of cheap asymmetric pressure against a massive military? Look at what Ukraine is doing to Russia's wallet in the Black Sea right now.
This is one of the most remarkable developments in modern naval warfare, and I know it's something our own military is studying obsessively.
Oh, totally. Let's break down the mechanics of what the Ukrainians are calling Operation Malachka. Ukraine, a country that effectively has no traditional navy left at all, used a swarm of cheap drones and unmanned surface vehicles to launch 136 devastating strikes in just 10 days against Russia's Shadow Fleet.
For our listeners who might not be super familiar with the mechanics of global shipping, the Shadow Fleet is a massive collection of old, decrepit oil tankers.
It's floating rust buckets, basically.
Much. And to understand why this fleet exists, you have to look at maritime insurance. The big Western insurance groups control something like 90% of global shipping insurance.
And you have to have this insurance to dock at any major port in the world, right?
Exactly. When we, the U.S. and our G7 allies, put sanctions and a price cap on Russian oil, Russia couldn't use those Western insurers anymore.
So they basically just created their own black market logistics network.
Right. They started buying up these rusted out 30-year-old tankers that were literally destined for the scrapyard. They register them in places with lax oversight. They turn off their maritime tracking transponders and then sail them through international waters to buyers in Asia.
It is the primary financial artery funding their whole war effort.
It is their lifeline.
And Ukraine just went after that artery with a swarm of robotic bees, 136 strikes in 10 days. The fallout from this drone swarm has been monumental. Because of the sheer density of the attacks, Russia was actually forced to shut down the Volga-Don Canal,
which is a massive logistical artery connecting the Caspian and Black Seas.
Right. And on top of that, it caused a massive fuel crisis in Crimea. You had local populations completely panicking, lining up for hours for gasoline because the medium-sized tankers that supply the peninsula were either destroyed or just too terrified to sail.
It is the ultimate David versus Goliath scenario.
Think about the economics of this. You have drones that cost maybe a few $1,000s to build, and they are sinking or disabling ships carrying tens of millions of dollars worth of oil and liquid natural gas. The return on investment is insane.
It really is.
Oh, okay, I have to play devil's advocate here for a second. Can you really starve a bear with just bee stings? I mean, Russia is a massive land power.
That is a very necessary reality check. Operation Malachka is a tactical masterpiece. It is humiliating for the Russian Navy, and it is definitely bleeding them financially. But Russia is incredibly resilient.
They always seem to find a way around it.
They do. In response to the Black Sea dangers, they are rapidly building alternative land routes. They are laying new railway lines down to the occupied territories, and they still have their deep-water shadow fleet moving through other routes to Asia.
So the drones alone aren't going to just magically end the war?
No, they won't. They increase the friction and the cost exponentially. But to truly starve the wolf, the kinetic military action by Ukraine has to be paired with financial action by us.
We need our Treasury Department to get involved.
Exactly. We need to enforce strict secondary sanctions on the insurance and registry companies that are backing that shadow fleet in third-party countries. Unless we cut the financial paperwork that allows these ships to dock globally, the black market will always find a way to keep moving the oil.
Which brings up a huge question for us locally. What does this mean for our tech scene here at home? Because I know Silicon Valley is watching this Black Sea stuff incredibly closely.
Oh, absolutely. The Pentagon is looking at Ukraine and realizing that our traditional defense primes the ones building these billion-dollar aircraft carriers. are incredibly vulnerable to a $10,000 drone.
It flips the whole script.
It does. So now you have this massive pivot where our defense sector is tapping into nimble Silicon Valley startups to build these autonomous systems. And that brings us directly to our own backyard strategy for the Taiwan Strait.
Yes, let's talk about our policy for Taiwan. We have heard our Indo-Pacific commander, Admiral Samuel Paparo, talk about his hellscape strategy. And recently, the director of the American Institute in Taiwan, Raymond Green, introduced this concept of the wasp nest.
It is a very vivid image.
Right. The entire idea is to just flood the Taiwan Strait with thousands of drones, unmanned subs, and surface vehicles to deter a potential invasion.
The logic is to replicate the exact nightmare Russia is facing in the Black Sea, but on an even larger scale. You make the Strait so lethal, so chaotic, and so unpredictable that an amphibious invasion becomes mathematically just too costly to even attempt.
But Beijing is absolutely furious about this. I mean, they are losing their minds over Taiwan buying defensive drones and over our strategy to arm them this way. And, I was reading some analysis recently that used a really dark but incredibly accurate psychological analogy for this dynamic.
The abusive partner analogy.
Yes. It is dark, but structurally it fits the geopolitical behavior perfectly. It is like this abusive partner saying, "Marry me or I'll hit you. And how dare you buy pepper spray? You were just provoking me and ruining our harmony."
It is a wild way to frame it.
Like, how can you blame the person buying the pepper spray for the violence? It is classic victim blaming.
It is the textbook definition of coercive diplomacy. Beijing hates the wasp nest concept because it destroys their ultimate strategic dream, which military strategists call the fait accompli.
Okay, let's break down the mechanics of a fait accompli for the audience.
Sure. It means a done deal. A quick, bloodless victory. Beijing's ideal scenario isn't a grinding 4-year war of attrition like we see in Ukraine.
Right, they don't want to get bogged down.
Exactly. Their ideal scenario is a lightning strike. Seizing control before we, the U.S., or our regional allies can even mobilize a response.
But if the Strait is a literal wasp nest,
a fait accompli is impossible. They would have to chew through thousands of lethal drones, taking massive casualties, stretching the timeline out for weeks or months. And that gives us and the international community time to actually intervene.
So that pepper spray, to use our analogy, completely ruins their ability to quietly and quickly force compliance.
Exactly right.
That makes total sense. But we also have to look at this impartially from inside Taiwan, because it is not just Beijing pushing back against the wasp nest. There is a massive internal democratic debate going on in Taiwan right now regarding this exact strategy.
Yes, and it is vital we look at this objectively. You have pushback from Taiwan's opposition parties, primarily the KMT and the TPP, and it is very easy for some Western commentators to just lazily label them as being pro-Beijing.
Which happens a lot in our media.
Far too often. But when you look at their actual arguments in their legislature, the mechanics of their pushback are way more nuanced.
Right. They aren't necessarily against drones or defending the island.
No, not at all. They are primarily pushing back against the funding mechanism. The ruling party wants to use a special budget of 210 billion new Taiwan dollars for these asymmetric weapons.
That is a huge amount of money outside the normal budget.
Exactly. So the opposition parties are demanding that this money go through regular fiscal oversight channels. They want to prevent corruption and ensure transparency. They are basically worried about handing the military blank checks without legislative scrutiny.
Which is a completely standard democratic debate. I mean, Washington has those exact arguments every single day when it comes to our defense spending. We want transparency too.
Right. And furthermore, they argue that acting like a literal wasp nest, constantly buzzing, highly militarized, and aggressively posturing, might prematurely trigger that abusive partner into a catastrophic war.
So they want deterrence, but without the provocation.
Exactly. They are arguing for a balance. Having deterrence, but not completely abandoning diplomatic dialogue. It is a debate over how to survive next to a superpower without provoking the exact war you were trying to deter.
It's a terrifying tightrope to walk.
Yeah.
You need the drones so you don't get steamrolled.
Yeah.
But you have to manage the politics so you don't accidentally set off the powder keg.
And that is the true complexity of asymmetric warfare. It is not just about the technology. It is about how the technology alters the psychology, the economics, and the political calculations of the aggressor.
Wow. So what does this all mean for us? We've covered a lot of ground today, from the creeping economic and demographic takeover of Siberia by Chinese infrastructure to the robotic bee stings paralyzing the Russian shadow fleet in the Black Sea, all the way to our own hellscape strategy and what it means for American tech in the Taiwan Strait.
It is all connected.
It really is. The overarching narrative here is undeniable. Asymmetric strategies, whether they are demographic shifts, economic leverage, or a swarm of cheap tech, are fundamentally breaking the old rules of empire and military might. The days of just counting battleships and tanks to see who wins are over.
They really are. And if we connect this back to our own national security, it raises an important, almost provocative question for you, the listeners, to take away today.
Okay, well, the good takeaway.
If cheap off-the-shelf drones and calculated economic leverage can successfully stall and bleed nuclear superpowers right now, are we entering an era where our traditional billion-dollar military platforms like our aircraft carriers or our stealth bombers are becoming entirely obsolete?
That is a scary thought for our defense budget.
Right. Or, and this is the darker thought, will these massive superpowers simply develop more devastating, unconventional, perhaps non-kinetic ways to squash the wasps before they can even launch?
Oh, you mean like cyber warfare or electromagnetic pulses, things that just bypass the drones entirely?
Exactly. We might just be seeing the first step of a completely new kind of arms race.
That is a chilling thought and definitely something to mull over as we watch these tech developments unfold. We always want you to employ independent and critical thinking when you look at the news. The world is rarely as binary as the headlines want you to believe.
Absolutely. Always look deeper.
Thank you so much for joining us on this journey today. If you enjoyed the show, please hit that subscribe button for the Sip and Talk podcast so you never miss an update. And before we go, a huge shout out to our good friend Mickey. You have got to check out his YouTube channel, Mickey to Life, for his latest amazing travel vlogs. He's doing some incredible work out there.
Definitely go check out Mickey to Life. Thanks for listening, everyone.
See you next time. Keep your eyes open and keep questioning the narrative.